Howdy, folks. My name is Nicco. I'm the director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. We have a great panel tonight, and I'm thrilled everybody came out to see it. Immediately to my left is Jill Abramson, who spent the last 17 years at the New York Times. She was the first woman to serve as the Washington bureau chief, and then the first woman to serve as the managing editor, and then the first woman to serve as the executive editor. These days, she's actually here on campus teaching writing seminars, and I know there are a lecturer in the English department in FAS. Next to her is Noah Oppenheim. We're thrilled to have him. He has just been named pretty recently the president of NBC News, and we're thrilled to have him here today. He's responsible for all aspects of NBC News, including all 4 of its #1 broadcasts: NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, Today, Meet the Press with Chuck Todd, and Dateline. He also has oversight of all of the news division's digital properties, editorial units, investigative units, and all its bureaus around the world. Next to him is Sacha Pfeiffer. Sacha is a reporter covering nonprofits, philanthropy, and wealth at the Boston Globe, but she's on stage here in part because of her role on the Globe's Spotlight Investigative team that won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for its stories on clergy sex abuse. You may have heard her on our local WBUR station. While at WBUR, she won the National Edward R. Murrow Award for broadcast reporting. Jim Steyer is visiting us from San Francisco from the West Coast. There's a small university out that way. You may have heard of it, called Stanford. He teaches at the Stanford Law School, but he's one of the most respected experts and entrepreneurs on issues relating to children here in the United States. He's the co-founder and CEO of something called Common Sense, commonsense.org, which he'll talk a little bit about, and some of their new research, which helped prompt tonight's event. I worked with Jim last year prior to coming to Harvard at Common Sense. He's got a long and distinguished career. You can read this lengthy bio in your program. And in a little bit of a change up, Rick Weissbourd at the other end of the stage is going to be our moderator tonight, not me, so that I can participate in the discussion in a full and complicated way. And Rick, many of you know from, he's both on the faculty here at the Kennedy School, but also at the Graduate School of Education. He's the faculty director of Human Development and Psychology's master's program. He's done incredible work looking at vulnerability and resistance in childhood, the achievement gap, and especially moral development. With Stephanie Jones, he directs something called the Making Caring Common Project, a national effort to make moral and social development priorities in child raising and to provide strategies to schools and parents for promoting empathy in children, a commitment to justice and other key moral and social capacities. He's been an inspiration to me as a parent, in part through his own book, The Parents We Mean to Be, How Well-Intentioned Adults Undermine Children's Moral and Emotional Development. So thanks everyone for coming here tonight. I think I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and as always in the forum, we'll have a discussion in this panel for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to the microphones and hope to have many questions from our audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicco. It's good to see all of you. I know this is a very busy time, and I appreciate your interest in this topic, and I also appreciate being up here with these terrific panelists. We have a few topics we're going to try and cover. One is, there's a little bit of an echo. Is that irritating? Anyway, we have a few topics we're going to try and cover. One is the impact of the news on kids, and a recent report that Common Sense Media has done, which is a striking and important report that I'm going to ask Jim Steyer to talk about in just a minute, and I would love other panelists' reactions. We're also going to talk about how decisions are made about doing stories involving kids in the news, and what the impact of the news is on children, and particularly news that is upsetting, that is disturbing. So I think these are all topics we could talk for a very long time about, but we're going to try and stick to 40 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time for your questions and thoughts and for discussion. And to launch us, I'm going to ask Jim to start and to tell us a little bit about this report.
Well, it's great to be here. I am from the small university on the West Coast, and to be at the USC of the East is a really great honor. Is this BU? I forgot. Anyway, no, there are some highlights, and this is an awesome panel. Number one, kids care about the news. It's really important to them. I think that's the most important thing in these very unique times in our lifetimes. Kids really care about the news. 70% of them think that if they're informed, that it is a very important aspect of their life, makes them feel smarter, et cetera. Second, most of them, 60-something percent, 63%, feel afraid, sad, and depressed when they're exposed to the news. And I think that has to do both with the current political tumult we're experiencing, but also violence and some of the images that they experience visually and otherwise. Third, not surprisingly, they don't read paper newspapers very often anymore, and they primarily get their news from their family and then from social media platforms like Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, et cetera. Fourth, and I think this is also very important in the context of what's happened with the news media and the political realities of America today, they have a very difficult time telling the difference between fake news and true news. And that's because they've been bombarded, particularly on social media platforms and on the web, with stories that they cannot distinguish. So it's a remarkable picture, but I think but the number one focus when I looked at it in retrospect is they really care about the news. So what the news media does not only matters to everybody in this room, but really matters to our kids.
Great. Just to clarify one thing, my memory from the report is that kids are also investigators. So if they think the news is fake, they will do some research and find, is that?
In some cases, yes.
Yeah.
I think in some cases, and again, I think one of the things that's incumbent upon us in running a large education advocacy organization is giving the tools to know how to investigate and to distinguish between that kind of stuff.
So let me ask you a question, and maybe the whole panel can take it up. But so when you get data like this, that kids are sad or afraid or depressed, what does it leave you with? Does it leave you with, you know, on the one hand, you can sort of feel like we live in a country where a lot of parents have an allergy to their kids experiencing adversity of any kind, and you know, that there's a lot of truth to the helicopter parenting issue. On the other hand, the news is overwhelming. I think many of us are anxious and overwhelmed by it.
Correct.
So is there guidance in the report about how to think about this? And is it less exposure, more exposure, different age groups? How do you think about it?
In three ways. I think about it first as a parent, and also running the biggest kids media organization in the United States.
Yeah.
Number one, we have to educate parents about how to talk to their kids about this, how to engage them in this, and how to educate them. That's number one. Sacha's, your husband's a school teacher. The second thing, we have 130,000 member schools at Common Sense. Pretty remarkable. The vast majority of schools here in Massachusetts and across the country are members of Common Sense, largely because of a curriculum we built with Howard Gardner, your colleague at the Harvard Ed School. So we believe that we have to build a news literacy curriculum that we will share with every school and, quite frankly, all the classrooms across the country, that we have the ability to do that, and then we need to work with journalism professionals and news experts like the folks sitting to my right in order to make that happen. But third, I think we have to hold the media and technology industries accountable. I mean, if you really look at what the report says, one, there are some real lessons for people who run NBC News or the New York Times or the Boston Globe or Snapchat or whatever to take to heart about how we are all consuming and experiencing news today, but particularly how young people are. But I think the particular message to me is about the technology industry and the failure in many cases of the leaders of the most important technology companies in the country who are now delivering the news, even as much or more than NBC does, to take their responsibility seriously. And so I think it's parents, teachers and educators, and then the media industry itself and the technology industry itself being held accountable. But ultimately we have to give our kids the tools and resources they need to be able to think critically about the messages and to be informed, active citizens. There's never been a more important time in my lifetime for all of us and my own children to be informed and active citizens.
Great. Well, thank you. Jill or Sacha, no reactions to this, to the report, or to the idea of holding the media accountable, or any of you? Yeah.
I think point number one, that kids are very interested in the news, can't be emphasized enough. And, you know, if anything, I think some kids are turned off by the traditional way of presenting the news. And, you know, I've done a lot of research. I'm working on a book about BuzzFeed and Vice, which both do a lot of quality news. And, you know, Shane Smith, the head of Vice, is especially passionate about the fact that young people are extremely interested in the news, but they need to be engaged in somewhat different ways, which I think is true. You know, the report's findings about Facebook and other social platforms taking more responsibility is, you know, I think the most burning issue in the media right now, because Facebook and others have taken the position that they aren't really publishers, but they're the primary distribution system for news content now. So why aren't they somewhat considered publishers and bound by some of the same responsibilities that actually publishers or presidents of networks have? And, you know, Mark Zuckerberg is going to be the commencement speaker here at Harvard, so it'd be maybe an occasion to press that point. They see themselves as neutral platforms that are just, you know, of service to people, including young people, by having all kinds of content available and, you know, quote unquote, you know, for Facebook, connecting people. And I'm not putting that down, but I think given especially the role of fake news and the manufacturing of fake news, the profit making from it, it's only going to get bigger. And it isn't the only issue of concern in terms of the technology by which news spreads. But yeah, I think that finding is critically important. And last, including, I think, in schools themselves, like some study of the news and using journalism as educational tools is vital. And the New York Times has long had, you know, a great and very active program of providing, you know, the news report free to school teachers. And there's a whole program of instruction about how to incorporate the news in school at, you know, relatively young age. So I have not yet had a chance to read the full report, but I can't wait.
Jill, you were talking a little bit about Vice and BuzzFeed. And do you think that do you see any tensions between the ways younger audiences may want to consume the news and some fundamental news values themselves? Is that a challenge? For example, sometimes, you know, younger audiences want news that is more personal, delivered in a more personal or intimate way, or sometimes with more of an advocacy or solutions journalism approach.
Yeah, that's sort of the same question. In the shift to different news sources, is there something lost? Are there things gained? How do you think about it?
Well, yeah, I'm of the belief that as long as the information is quality information and accurate, you know, in terms of the news, that, you know, creating wide interest is a good, you know, the ends justify the means, so to speak. And you know, I'm just thinking about Vice has a new daily news show on HBO at 7:30 at night, and I don't think it has a huge audience of kids. It has a really good audience of younger viewers, you know, 18 to 30, and you know, the style is different. There's no, you know, voice of authority, there's no anchor. The correspondents are very much in the middle of the action and are characters in the stories. And that isn't how I worked at NBC News a zillion years ago as a researcher in the election unit, but it's totally different from what the news values were at NBC News at that time. But, you know, I think that Vice does a good job of engaging a younger audience in the news, and that, you know, they pay attention to accuracy, and that for the most part, it's quality. Sometimes it definitely has a point of view.
Yeah, I mean, with regard to Vice and BuzzFeed, I think it's important to distinguish between the stylistic and aesthetic approach that they take versus sort of fundamental news values. You know, a lot of what they do is somewhat superficial in terms of repackaging it, the same information in a way that might be more appealing to a generation that just has grown up with different forms of media. I think, and I don't have any problem with that. I think where we get into trouble is that, you know, there are some fundamental values that are really different. And, you know, BuzzFeed, for instance, got into quite a kerfuffle recently when they published the Steele dossier without vetting it in any way. In fairness, in this internet age, that dossier would have been published by somebody, but if you're claiming to run a journalistic enterprise, I do think there are some responsibilities that come along with that, as opposed to just.
I'm just not sure. I don't think the position of Ben Smith was that he had no responsibility. He made a considered decision that, you know, because the president and Donald Trump had been briefed on this, that it was a legitimate source of news. So I don't see responsibility was an issue.
I'm not suggesting he was necessarily wrong about, but in terms of his description of their attitude towards news, his comment was that they don't view themselves necessarily as gatekeepers, that they believe that the public can look at that dossier and decide for itself the accuracy of it. And that's where, to me, the most interesting thing about this report is the educational piece, the news literacy piece, because I do think that if we're relying upon Facebook and Snapchat and those distribution platforms to be the filters, we're going to be out of luck. And I think, in fairness, it's not that, you know, there have been newspapers in cities like New York and magazines at every grocery store checkout counter for decades that have been publishing what we would call fake news. That's just as inaccurate, just as salacious. The equivalent of every National Enquirer cover is analog clickbait. And so we've always had to rely upon an educated population to tell the difference between what's real and what's not. And the problem may have blown up recently because of these new distribution mechanisms. But I think that at the end of the day, teaching kids the tools that they need to distinguish between what's legitimate journalism, what's not, to make decisions about what's accurate and what's not, to be able to recognize where a piece of material has a point of view. To me, that's the only solution that we can count on, because trying to erect filters and barriers is not going to work.
You know, and I think in a way what we're talking about is sort of doesn't even matter what age we are. I think people of every age now feel overwhelmed by trying to figure out what's correct, what's not. This movement for news literacy applies to every age. And you know, yes, there's always been the National Enquirer. I think the difference is now, if we're getting all our information on, say, Twitter, we don't know whether half the tweets we're seeing were formed by a bot that was set up to promote one candidate or one cause. It's not really a real person, so it's a artificial volume in a sense. The other thing I'll say is that newspapers now, certainly the legacy papers, think obsessively about how to try to give all readers, and in particular young people, news the way they want it. Do we have to do video? Do we need companion podcasts even if you're a newspaper? Are we giving you stories too long? And there's sort of an irony to this, because I think in some ways newspapers feel like they have lost the younger generation, at least as paying readers, but we still think about how can we give them news in the way they want it. So we battle between thinking we've lost them versus we need to retool our product in a way that people want it. The other thing I want to introduce is that when Nicco had asked me to do this, he was talking about a panel about news and kids. And my question had been, do you mean newspapers trying to sort of find ways to appeal to younger readers? And maybe you can summarize your answer. You were talking about your frustration with the emphasis that you think newspapers put on older people's interests. Can you kind of summarize what you had said to me?
And there are actually two parts to that. One was the looking at, the vast majority of subscribers. First of all, the vast majority of investigative and reporters in the United States, they are at newspapers. And the vast majority of newspaper subscribers are over 70, and in some markets, over 80. I mean, it's a lunatic equation age-wise. And so there's a natural incentive to cover stories that disproportionately affect older readers. For example, healthcare or social policy that affects older readers. And there's a clear trend, we've documented it, in a decline in journalism that covers issues that are relevant to parents or to affect the lives of children. And trying to understand some of the motivations which aren't necessarily intentional in newsrooms. The second part was that came out for me out of both this study and I'd say a companion study the Shorenstein Center's done, is when we looked at all of the election news published by in different time periods, approximately 15 different major outlets, from the New York Times to NBC, Fox, Wall Street Journal, but all major media outlets, a mix of print, digital, and TV. And we looked at Tom Patterson's study, looking at all this election coverage, and it is overwhelmingly about the horse race, and not about issues. But that's a little chicken or the egg. There's actually a big study released yesterday that neither presidential campaign wanted to talk about the issues and avoided talking about them for the most part. But a more significant thing, in a sense, is that in the general election, the vast majority of the coverage was negative. It was the tone. We did some looking at keywords and coding. It's overwhelmingly negative. And when we think about the decisions we make, that newsrooms make in covering issues, I'd love to hear, from all the three journalists on the panel, your experience covering issues and the concerns. Are you ever worried about it being too negative?
Well, to the first part of what Nicco said, I was really interested in this idea that I was trying to decide if I disagreed that newspapers are gearing our coverage based on demographics. Are we writing more stories about, say, pharma and healthcare because that's what aging people think? And I'm curious to hear what Jill thinks. I don't think so, and I was actually talking to some editors at the Globe this week. I think, in a way, you can't have this conversation without looking at the financial situation in newspapers today, which I'm sure you all know is pretty dire. I mean, the Globe used to have bureaus all over the world, South Africa, Latin America. We used to have national bureaus all over the country, Los Angeles, South. All the foreign bureaus are gone. The only national bureau left is a handful of people in Washington, D.C. And as newspapers keep having to cut and cut, we lose things, any beat that seems like a luxury. We used to have someone at the Globe who covered animals. She wrote about pets and zoos, gone. We used to have a parenting columnist, gone. And so I think what happens is you end up focusing on the most important things, pharmaceuticals, and things like parenting and kids end up just being covered on a hit or miss basis. We'll do a trend story about helicopter parenting or slow parenting or how to talk to your kids after the election. But I, at least personally, don't think that demographics are guiding coverage. Jill, do you feel like that at the Times?
Yeah, I think that that's true, but I feel I also have to second guess my answer because so much of the story selection is governed in some ways by the interests of editors, and in general at the Times, the editors, were not spring chickens.
I mean, for whatever it's worth, on television, we're interested, our business is governed by how many 18 to 54-year-olds we can get to watch. So we're not interested in 80-year-olds from a business standpoint. So that's certainly not what's guiding us. And we have the Today Show is a morning program that is geared towards very much those issues of parenting, kids, health, wellness, but with a younger skewing lens. So we're very much devoting resources to covering those things.
Well, part of it is also about in social policy, at least.
Yeah.
The emphasis in social policy over the last 35 years, from spending spending on social policy that affects children, particularly education, as a percentage of total spending, has plummeted over the last 30 years. And spending on social policy that affects older Americans has ballooned.
So 3 quick points. One, just to pick up on when Nicco started, we started Common Sense News, a new division at Common Sense, to cover these issues because we were worried actually that at the Globe, or not necessarily the Times or the Today Show, because you guys are really well-resourced, those are really well-resourced organizations, but that there was not enough coverage of kids and education issues, and that has a direct impact on social policy and investment. So we started, just like Kaiser Health that started News or ProPublica, to cover it. We felt someone had to cover those issues in a nonpartisan, thoughtful, journalistic way. But I think 2 other points. One, about the responsibility of the tech industry. Look, we work with them all the time, obviously. We are, in many ways, the most important advocate towards them and critic of them on a lot of different levels. With the scale that Facebook, Google, and others are at right now, and they put out a business that they've decimated the journalism industry. For them to turn around and say they have no responsibility to also deliver news, I would exempt sort of the broadcast medium that you oversee to some extent no on this, because I think you guys have strong journalistic standards. That's a joke. It's a pathetic answer, in my opinion, whether Mark Zuckerberg is your key graduation speaker here at Harvard or not. The industry directly impacted the entire news media, and now they have no standards or no responsibility, until after the election when we see what happened. But the other point that I think is relevant about whether it's, I don't know if I'd say BuzzFeed or Vice, is the other thing that's happened when young people now get their news primarily in an online or social media context, which is what Eli Paris or another called the filter bubble. So now it's so easy to only get one very, very, very small slice of news. So part of what I think has to happen in news literacy, which I do believe should happen at all levels of society, and I believe we will commit to doing that in schools across the country and maybe to parents, is you have to also have a diversity of voices. If the Steyer kids only read, Nick Kristof and Sacha's investigative reporting, and don't open themselves up to other viewpoints because of the filter bubble that's allowed via algorithms and other ways that news feeds are now done on Facebook and other platforms, they're not getting a very accurate portrait of the world. They're getting a very narrow, self-reinforcing echo chamber. So I think that's one of the other big things that we as a society and you as leading journalists need to take on, which is no matter what your perspective, we are now seeing this deeply polarized country, and now with this extraordinary figure in the White House who's only going to polarize it more. So therefore, I think there's a responsibility on the part of major media and tech companies to try, and I actually think NBC does that. I'm serious. And I actually think the New York Times and the Boston Globe try to do that. But I don't see that out of Facebook and Google and Snapchat, which are much richer, much wealthier companies, which are delivering to much larger audiences in many ways. I think that's a huge part of the broader equation for young people and where the news media is going to go.
So we have a couple other topics to get to, but responses to this from anybody on the panel?
We needed a chair for Facebook here.
I believe several of them went to this university.
A few went to Stanford, too.
That is true, actually. That is true.
Well, I think they're in uncharted territory, too. I mean, I think we're all trying to figure it out together. And we have seen Mark Zuckerberg step forward and say, I'm working on it. We've seen Jack Dorsey say, I'm going to crack down on these fake accounts. So I think that they're hearing the public pressure and trying to be responsive, but they're clearly late.
They're feeling their employees' pressure. They're feeling their employees' pressure. That's the world I live in. There's a libertarian ethos there that does not exist in this place or others about whatever happens. This is all we care about. We're a public company. You know,
in fairness to them, though, I mean, look, as much as I would like to see Facebook, prioritize or privilege NBC News in everyone's news feed, it would be great.
Yeah.
It is a dicey proposition when you start differentiating between quote unquote credible news sources and not. I mean, there are millions of Americans, perhaps tens of millions of Americans, who would say Breitbart is as credible as NBC News. I might disagree. Everyone in this room and in this zip code might disagree. But if Facebook starts, if Facebook starts awarding credibility ratings to people and factoring that into the algorithm, that gets pretty political pretty quickly.
For part of my perspective is that it took print journalism, 50 to 75 years to develop standards of sourcing, of ethical reporting, of not printing hearsay, of ombudsman behavior. It took a long time, and the industry wrestled with it, right? What did newspapers have a special responsibility to the public sphere? That was a crucial question, 100, 125 years ago. And you can look at, for example, the Spanish-American War and the role of newspapers in kind of flaming the public's perceptions, arguably fake news. And even the whole reason we have the Pulitzer Prizes was a feeling that journalism was a cesspool that needed to be inspired and encouraged to actual public search to tell the truth. And so when I look at the moment the big digital platforms are in, that feels to me like they're kind of at that early stage of trying to figure, they don't have a sense. I think journalism has a really intense sense of its responsibilities to the public sphere. It like infuses the culture of the companies and the institutions. And I think the big digital platforms don't have that in the same way, or at the very beginnings of understanding their own power.
I don't think we can waste that much time until they get that, though.
I think we should say for the record that Facebook is actually trying and working on a plan to put warnings on certain stories, and I agree with you. This is like the beginning of trying to beta test various ways to do that. So they're not being totally libertarian.
Yeah, I mean, all of us who work at newspapers and TV stations and radio stations, these jobs involve an enormous amount of judgment, even in terms of what you cover, where you place it. And I think that that's finally dawning on organizations like Facebook, which is essentially a media organization, that there's judgment, and before it was a Wild West, and now it's not working, and they're trying to figure it out.
So let me just go back to something, Jill, that you said, but I'd be interested in all of your reaction. I think you were the first one to make the comment about schools having the responsibility to teach media literacy and to help kids discern the truth, which I absolutely agree with. I also think it's unlikely to happen in many schools around I also think it's unlikely to happen in many schools around the country, that it will happen in some schools, and it probably won't happen in most schools. And so it's making me think, are there other ways to do this? I mean, are there ways that you all think about, and this, Common Sense Media does wonderful work, are there ways to reach parents directly about this and to give them the tools to both for them and for their kids? Are there ways to reach teens directly? The answer may be no, but I'm worried that if we load this on schools, we're still going to have a big problem here.
I agree, but I would tell you, you can build the curriculum, and I can tell you we will build the curriculum. Now, it might not be perfect, and we'll need help from esteemed journalists, but I believe you can do that, and I do. Now, and it won't be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than it is right now. And I actually don't agree with you, Rick, that we have 130,000 member schools. That's 80-something% of all American schools are members of Common Sense. If we make a concerted effort to make it easy for the schools, they won't all teach it in the same way that your kids might get it or that your husband teaches in his school. But I will tell you, there's a way you can give it at least an entry level of news literacy that I think from 3rd or 4th grade on, you have to assess it and do it right. And there are people...
Jim, I'm sure you know this, but at Palo Alto High School, Esther has had for more than one of her daughters.
Susan is the head of YouTube, and her other was married to Sergey and runs 23. But the truth is, you can package that on a broad level, I think.
And she says she's never had, she's multiplied the number of classes she has.
I mean, just to be clear, I'm all for trying. But I am skeptical about a lot of places, and particularly because it's complex to teach. I mean, this is something that adults are having, but absolutely worth trying. Let me just switch gears, Nicco, unless you had something else you wanted to, because I know we have to, we have
We can keep going.
we have maybe 5 more minutes, is that right?
We'll give it 10.
Okay, great. I just wanted to turn to this other topic about, well, actually one finding from the report that I can't remember whether you mentioned or not, and that's that kids saying that the news about them, stories about them, seem disconnected from their experience.
Yes.
And I wondered whether your sense about why that might be true, how all of you think about that, whether that surprised you or not.
My 2 quick answers, and then the professional journalist should answer it. One is that I think that the dearth of coverage of kids and education issues that we were referring to earlier. So I think that young people look about stories about themselves, and not just the Beyonce story or whatever the latest music trend is. So I think part of it is just the lack of resources in different parts of the sphere of journalism to cover issues that matter and affect kids. I think the second issue is about racial and gender stereotypes. So one of the other findings that I didn't mention is that more than half of kids think that non-white kids are unfairly represented in the news media. So I have 4 kids, the youngest of whom is 13-year-old black boy. So Jesse, my son, has said to me on multiple occasions, Dad, the only time I'm ever in the news, somebody like me is when in handcuffs, or as a drug dealer, or as a gang member, right? Now he lives in an upper middle class home in San Francisco, so obviously that's not his reality, but he sees that. So I think part of the issue too is that we live in this incredibly diverse society where the youth population is extremely diverse. In California, for example, the vast majority of kids going to public school are kids of color, but they don't see themselves accurately represented. So I think that's part of it, by the way. And I think, and part of the fear factor, by the way, the whole Muslim ban, anti-immigrant stuff resonates unbelievably with young kids of color because of the stereotyping that's going on. So I think that's part of why they feel, remember, we're polling not people who look like us, we're polling America's young people today, which is much more diverse than our age population is. So I think that's one of the factors, and then also the dearth, the fact that maybe the Today Show actually has the resources and does cover issues like that, but the Globe, I'm sure, cut a lot of that stuff dramatically. So I think those are the 2 factors.
I think there are other factors too. I can, only speak from my experience at the Times, but, the Times as a product has always spoken to highly educated, affluent readers. Yeah. That's just who where the majority of readers are. So, I think the issue that you're raising is fair, that, in terms of resources and probably just creative thinking about how you cover issues of interest to young people, because the Times isn't really made for any young people except, sophisticated, educated readers. And
yeah, no, I mean, I wonder how much of that is a reflection of the political reality and just the reality of the world, right? I mean, we're obviously on some level simply reflecting what's going on, and so if they're reading about the Muslim ban and they're reading about Black Lives Matters and violent encounters with the police, then that's what they're seeing, but not because we are biased in some way, but simply because that's the world we live in, and that's unfortunate, and I find it sad, scary, and depressing also. So I think, I think that that's a piece of it. I can tell you that, as an organization, NBC is very conscious of trying to report on the experiences of a diverse population. Not only that, but we're very conscious of who's presenting the news. I mean, Lester Holt is, the first African-American anchor of an evening newscast. Our correspondent corps is diverse. So we're aware of it, we're conscious of it. We try to make sure that we're reporting on those communities in a way that reflects not just the struggles and challenges, but also the triumphs. But I think, again, as an adult reading what's happening in this world, I get discouraged also. So I don't know how much of that's just our current moment.
I think newspapers are pretty aware that they feel like some of the more diverse readers feel like they're not represented, and we spend a lot of time figuring out how to do that better. I also think this factors into what Jill said about even if we're trying to focus on younger people and sort of diverse readers, stories end up coming through the lens of the person writing them. So if it's an older newsroom, or I can think about times that we're just clumsy writing about contemporary issues. I feel like it was up till a few years ago, if the Globe ever wrote about a blog, it would then say, comma, fully known as a weblog, an online journal. Or if we say Snapchat, do we feel like we have to say a messaging platform in which messages disappear? And someone who uses it all the time will think, why are you telling me that? So newspapers have to write to people who are both, who are of an older generation who may not know and younger, and it can come across as clumsy sometimes.
What about the decisions? Like Noah, you were saying that you're kind of reflecting the world, but there is a fair bit of academic research that suggests that the age-old, if it bleeds, it leads, and that positive stories or stories that are more compelling, stories that are positive can be less compelling to readers. And I just wonder about editorially how you have each of you made those decisions or made those cases, and because I think that demonstrably affects, Rick kind of joked about how stressful it can be to watch the news sometimes, but if kids at an early age are feeling like this is just a heightened environment of stress and tension, I don't know what to do with that, because in some ways that is actually true. In other ways, the wall-to-wall coverage of the missing flight, well, that's not actually a reality that we deal with for the most part.
Well, yeah, the missing flight.
That was not your network.
That was not my network. But listen, it's funny because we're aware of the fact that acutely now more than ever that depressing, discouraging news is a turnoff to people. Since
is that showing up in market research? Since
the election, the universe of people watching any of the broadcast newscasts, both in the morning and the evening, has collapsed, down double digits in a way that we've never seen before. Fox News has seen significant growth, largely in older viewers, which would seem to suggest that perhaps the fake news campaign has worked to some extent in driving some of those folks to Fox. CNN and MSNBC have seen modest growth, where you have people who are sort of political junkies who really just eat it up despite the conflict, are going there. But your average viewer who doesn't love politics and who doesn't believe in the White House's worldview, they're turning it off because they just can't bear to watch. And we're all acutely aware of that, and it's putting tremendous market pressure on all three broadcast news divisions. But in terms of trying to cover things that are happy, you end up with, I certainly am not a if it bleeds, it leads, editorial leader, but we have a franchise in nightly news called Inspiring America, which is uplifting stories. And some of them are fantastic, and some of them are like, look at this cute kid who beat cancer. And that's great, but after the fifth cute kid who beat cancer, you do start to wonder, are we really doing a service here? Is this real journalism? And so it's a challenge to figure out how to do that in a way that feels substantive and meaningful, but that also gives people something to latch onto in a happy way.
Adults or kids. At the Times, very conscious of the steady drumbeat of the world is a terrible place, and an effort really to include solution side stories. The problem always is that those can seem dutiful and dull. And finding creative ways to tell those stories is a challenge, but a worthy one. I just think of, when I was a kid growing up, I was in 4th grade when President Kennedy was assassinated. And that was, a terrible, tragic event, but I can't tell you how interesting it was to everybody that I knew in the 4th grade. And it's how, I became interested in US history and politics, really. That came later, but, I was interested in, Lee Harvey Oswald and all of that. And some of the best-selling children's books are about pretty terrible episodes. I mean, disaster is fascinating.
The one thing I'd say, huge challenges for the news business right now, huge, but also huge opportunity. Because with the complete dysfunction of Washington, D.C., the role of the news media has never been more important. And I think I actually think, Noah, your point, look, I turn off that. I don't want to watch that. I don't want to watch Today, the first hour. I don't want to watch Donald Trump over and over again saying bizarre things. And I go to ESPN and just watch the Warriors game. And it's better stuff to not wake up and get depressed at 7 o'clock in the morning. But I do think that's an opportunity because there's never been, meaning in the tumult that has happened politically, but also in the changes in the news business and in the change of media, there's never been a greater reverence for the importance of news. I actually do believe that's true with people of all different stripes. So to me, you're going to have to get through a few months here of just dealing with the reality that happened. But I do think that there is a greater reverence for the role of the news media in holding our society accountable, political leaders accountable, that has as a potential silver lining if we invest in it and double down on it. That's the optimistic piece that I see.
One other topic before, and then we'll turn to the audience. I did want to get to this topic about decisions about making running stories that may be upsetting to children, or stories involving children that are upsetting. And I want to turn to you first, Sacha, and in terms of the stories you have done on child sexual abuse. But I'm just curious how all of you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, we don't and can't not cover issues just because they will be upsetting to people, children or otherwise. We certainly have to think about how we cover them. It may be more of an issue for television when you're talking about imagery. When we did the clergy sex abuse stories, we spent a lot of time talking to adult men who, when they were children or teenagers, had been sexually abused by priests. Those were very delicate conversations in which we sometimes had to ask for details. If someone just said to me, I was molested, I had to find a sensitive way to say, can you tell me some more about what exactly happened? Because those details might determine whether someone was raped, and that might eventually enable a prosecutor to send a priest to jail, and sometimes did. So I think it just, it involves a great deal of judgment, and then we thought a lot about how we wrote. We were very careful in terms of not wanting to be salacious. We simply had to let the facts speak for themselves. So I think it's that judgment that comes in and the kind of coverage we do and how we present it.
Noah or Jill, you want to add?
Yeah, we're acutely conscious of it. Our two flagship shows air at times of day when often children are in the room with their parents watching, and so, but we're also similarly, we can't avoid covering things that are unpleasant. We have to do. We try to give fair warning. We try to say, you may want to send your kids out of the room. What you're about to see may be disturbing. But it's hard to shield children. I was telling you beforehand, the Times a number of years ago, I'm a subscriber, get it delivered to my door every day, had to put a cover above put a photo above the fold of a scene in Syria, and it was this sort of a bombed out cityscape, and my 4-year-old son saw it on the kitchen table, and no exaggeration, for a year, every night before bed, he would ask me about what's happening in Syria. And so, we just live in a world where it's hard to shield children from that entirely.
An effort and standard at the time to try to minimize for above the fold, if the analog print paper is on the kitchen table, to not have that.
Yeah.
But
it weren't dead bodies.
But in some cases, that's reality, and you don't pick. We didn't, when there was that horrible photos of burnt bodies hanging from that bridge in Iraq. No, we would not have put that above the fold. But when you're making digital decisions, as you pointed out, kids are doing all of their news consumption digitally. So it's really harder to have those kinds of standards when stories are moving all around, on your website, and then, if it's a Facebook link, that a friend is sending you, there's no way to shield.
And also, are we doing people a disservice if we censor too much. I mean, whenever I travel in Europe, I look at some of the pictures in the papers and I'm shocked because they are so unfiltered. Yeah. You get a totally different view of war. I mean, in this country, do we still have a rule that you can't show dead soldiers being taken home? I mean, are we, does that, as a result, are people not really having a full understanding of the tragedy of war? So, I think that you can argue it both ways.
All right. Why don't we turn to the audience? And I think I'm handing it back to you, Nicco. Is that right?
Folks may know there are 4 microphones. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 down here and 2 up there. And there are 3 rules. 1, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are. If you're a student, what part of the college you're a student in, college, university. 2, no speeches. I'll cut you off. And 3, you must end it with a question mark. Matt.
Hi, I'm Matthew Spector. I'm a first-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I'm curious for your takes on the fate of public media in the country. We didn't talk a lot about PBS and the administration's threats to cut funding or significantly reduce funding. And what does that mean for the discourse in the country? Is public media still necessary in this day and age, and as we become more discerning consumers around our media consumption and this continuing disintermediation of the media more generally? 2 questions, I suppose.
It's still vitally important because by and large, public media is quality, if it's news, high quality news, and there's too little of that now. So, yeah, I think it's irreplaceable, in fact.
I've worked for both public media and private. I work for an NPR station in Boston as well as the Globe. And I mean, many public radio stations are getting a Trump bump right now, just like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal have seen a bump in subscriptions, and ProPublica, the nonprofit news agency or organization, has seen a bump. Public radio is benefiting. In fact, in some ways, the newspapers like ours can't benefit as much because we can't take charitable donations, right? And because we're not a national paper, we're not seeing that bump. So I think public radio right now is benefiting in a way from more than some of the for-profit papers are.
Sure. Thank you.
Miriam?
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a student at HKS. I'm also the Director of Communications and Education at a center at the Ed School. And it struck me while I was listening to you that the way that you talk about what kids need to learn, like what media literacy should look like, is about how they consume news. So like how they distinguish fact from alternative fact, how they identify fake news. But we're no longer in this era of highlights and weekly reader where you flip through content. It's like new media is rather participatory. It's about production and behavior. And so I'm curious, what behaviors do we need to teach students to do, like in order to be better participatory citizens in the media?
I actually think part of what your question has suggested some of the answer, which is, I think to teach kids to do critical thinking about the news and media in general, they have to be creators. So I think what we're going to see is encouraging young people to do their own investigation of stuff. I think so part of it is them creating their own thing, but I think it's also, I heard Rick, you said earlier how tough it is to create this on a scale that will really have an impact, particularly in less well-resourced schools around the country, right? But I actually think part of it is there are some basics to critical thinking that can be taught at any school, but I also think encouraging kids to create. That's how media literacy is all about. If you learn how to make an ad, or you learn how to make, then you realize, oh, that's being fake. So a lot of it's encouraging their own creativity. So I think that's a big element of it, actually. I don't know what other people think, but I think it's a big.
I think part of the answer is, I hope we haven't left a false impression that news that children are interested in is mostly stories about children, because I think if there's something that interests young people, the environment does. And that even when you're doing, I guess, stories that we'd agree were negative about global warming and whatnot, I mean, young people eat up those stories, and I think it helps spark not only concern, but a desire and determination to try to do something to counter what's happening.
Hey, Howard Cohen, first year MPP student here at the Kennedy School. Maybe my question is more directed to Noah. We have a president who is interested in kind of watching morning news these days. What's your take on how that maybe affects newsrooms in terms of the decisions of what is and what is not put on the news?
We try to conduct ourselves in such a way that does not take into account the president's reaction to what we're reporting. We've tried very hard to not fall prey to that distraction. I think what I've tried to impart to people is that we know our standards and we know our job, and we're going to keep doing it regardless of what the peanut gallery is saying, even if one of them happens to hold a high office. Well, Joe Scarborough is a commentator on MSNBC, which is, in the same way that the Times has Ross Douthat and Nick Kristof, and we have Joe Scarborough, and we have commentators who are largely on the cable channel.
But I'm assuming, on this very day, there's been a brouhaha about Andrea Mitchell, and media organizations on the right, are attacking her for basically doing her job.
Yep.
And I'm assuming your full support is clearly behind her. Yeah.
Unequivocally.
So.
Well, we've had Andrea Mitchell's been attacked. The president encouraged a mob of people to target Katie Tur during the campaign. Several of our journalists have been attacked for doing their job over the course of the past year. And we stand completely behind them, and I'm really happy to say not a single one of them are remotely intimidated by it. So.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. My name's Sam Kessler. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question, you guys can decide who's best suited to answer, and maybe a few of you can, but obviously there's a big divide that we see in our country right now, and I'm just curious, you've talked a lot about your responsibilities in terms of what your news organizations need to do in order to be correct, to be factual, but I'm also curious if you think that your organizations or news organizations in general, separate from social media, have done anything which has fueled the divide that we're seeing, and do you think you've got a responsibility in order to make that divide less prevalent, and can you actually do anything about that?
What have you done to fuel the divide in this country?
This is a big soul-searching debate happening in the media right now. It's a weird, hard time to be in the media because, like everyone else, we're still adjusting to the results of this election, no matter what your politics were. But then also the media took such a beating for what its role may or may not have been. What did we do? What did we not do? And so I think we're still sorting that through and trying to reassess what our jobs are and how do we do it at a time when we have these unprecedented decisions to make, like if someone says something's not true, do we call that a lie? We're seeing major editors of different papers come down differently on that decision. So I think it's uncharted territory, and we're trying to figure it out as we go.
Let me just add to that. So, Jill, when you say that New York Times readers are wealthy, educated, and I assume primarily, if not entirely liberal, I don't know if that's true or not, but largely largely liberal, sorry.
I've heard Steve Bannon reads in here.
Yeah, that's right. So, but is there conversation at NBC or the Globe or about the question of how do we extending your audience? And
for sure.
Yeah. And
for sure. Well, look, I think there's.
And how far does it go? Is it sort of expanding the number of roughly Democrats, liberals, or is it really about moving pretty deeply into Trump supporter country? And
well, to me, it's less about that, and it's more about, have we done enough to report on and cover the experience of Americans outside of the coastal bubbles, right? It's less of an audience play, and it's more of there was clearly an undercurrent of frustration and economic distress and anger in this country and hostility towards institutions that probably was not adequately reported on and reflected in our respective publications and broadcasts. And what can we do to get out in the field and go into places like Erie, Pennsylvania, and Flint, Michigan, and other places, and really explore what's been happening to large cross sections of the population that, you know, if you're in Boston or New York, you probably are not seeing. So
at the Times, the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger Jr. and Dean Baquet, who's now executive editor, shortly after the election, they released a letter that, you know, said we wish we had done more of exactly what Noah is talking about, and, you know, pledged and rededicated the organization to doing that.
On the other hand, I mean, the Globe, yes, immediately after the election, we started talking about, do we need to do our coverage differently? Do we need to start driving out to Central and Western Mass more? This morning, WBUR started a series where they are going to go to Ware, Massachusetts tomorrow, and they went somewhere on the New Hampshire line. But I'm still not sure we've got it right, because I have neighbors across the street in Cambridge who voted for Trump because they're upset about the Iran deal. I've got affluent friends in Belmont who voted for Trump because they want their taxes lowered. I was at a fancy bar in Newburyport where I heard the guy next to me say, Roger Goodell is more corrupt than Hillary Clinton. And I thought, we don't have to drive to Central and Western Mass to find Trump supporters. So I think that our instinct is still, where are these people? They're in remote rural parts of the state, and we have to think, no, it's actually people all around us. So again, it's how we cover and where we go to do that coverage.
I mean, I'll just bring an academic perspective here, that the country is remarkably divided. It is more polarized than it has been by almost any measure since the turn of the last century. And in news consumption, that's definitely true. There's a new study, I guess it was in October, from UNC about news deserts, about big chunks of the country where there is no local news. And in places that are news deserts, you end up, like Noah was saying, really with opinion. You end up with talk radio primarily. And so I think that the challenge is actually and truly an audience challenge, that between trends in media consumption on Facebook and other social platforms and the collapse of local news, we actually don't have a shared public experience of the world anymore.
Hi, my name is Marie Lawrence. I'm a first-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. Thank you so much for being here. You've already mentioned this top-line stat: 74% of the surveyed youth think that the media should show more people their age rather than grown-ups talking about them. Also, in this great report, mentions that most youth get their news from family and friends, but they would prefer to get it on social media. And it sort of strikes me that what's attractive about social media is that it puts kids in the driver's seat. They get to curate what they share, and they also get to create content themselves. I also know that about 20% of youth who are enrolled in high school have a job. So just wondering if there are any serious efforts to engage youth in newsmaking itself through employment and also in conversations like this one where they could speak directly to what's most interesting to them. Thanks.
I think that's a great question. I actually think that's a great question. Not just because it comes out of a Common Sense Media report, but I think that's a great question. That was my point earlier about news literacy, is that you have to create content. But I'd be interested, it's interesting, I particularly think, I just ask you, because have you thought about it? I mean, all the different platforms that you now oversee at NBC, do you think that would work? Is that something you could conceive of, or do you think it'd be a little too loosey-goosey? Yeah, I know. That's actually good. That's also only
half jokingly.
I agree.
We have, obviously, as I'm sure the Globe and the Times, we have internship programs to hire college students. Look, I'm a big believer. I started at my high school newspaper, wrote for the newspaper here at Harvard. I'm a big believer in high school journalism, college journalism, and the importance of those things. We do actively look to recruit young people into the organization. It's an interesting challenge, right? I mean, like you wouldn't take a 14-year-old and put him in an operating room, and it's hard to take a 14-year-old and say, okay, do a news, put together a spot for the evening news. But we do it within reason and when it's age appropriate. I'm not sure how else we would go about it.
Thanks so much for being here. My name's Cornelia Hall. I'm a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School and a print newspaper subscriber, so I guess not the main age demographic, sounds like, for that. But my question is kind of similar. I'm thinking about kids' developmental changes, since I was growing up without really the internet, like the effect of it on their attention spans. And I'm wondering, I was listening recently to a children's book author talking about how his latest book has shorter chapters and more action. And I'm wondering, you've been talking about kind of like the news that kids are in the room for, maybe not created specifically for them, but I'm just wondering how much you think the news industry is catering to shorter attention spans, especially kids who are, for whom the internet has shortened that span, and and for adults too, maybe, and how you all are balancing that.
I think one way is to accept a fundamental reality, which is for kids and adults, news consumption is mostly on the smartphone. And that adds, I think, more to, because it's a scroll and the incentive to keep going for something long is difficult. And I think shorter attention spans from this technology contributes, but I think the device itself and its dominance is a giant factor too.
I agree. I think it's a tremendous problem, and I see it as a parent of my own kids, and I see it at work as well, and I think it's only getting worse. I mean, if you talk to, if you think about Snapchat, which has become the dominant social media platform amongst young people, and I mean, you guys would know better, but an individual snap is it can only be 15 seconds or something like that. And when you talk to them about the way their audience and their users consume the shows that they've started to put up on Snapchat Discover, their whole mantra is 7-second cuts every 7 seconds, no longer than 7 seconds. So, all these mediums are kind of forcing us to cater our storytelling in such a way that, again, is not in depth and is, constant change and edits and shiny graphics and rainbow vomit and all the things that Snapchat has brought into the vernacular. But, if you're 13 and you spend most of your time on Snapchat, you expect to receive information that way.
I think it's a really interesting question. One of my students at Stanford started Periscope. He actually helped build the first common sense app. And then he started Periscope. And I think that some of the solutions are not going to come from us. That actually there's going to be a new generation of young people who are committed to, by the way, who model themselves after Noah or Sacha or Jill or Nicco or Rick or anybody, but who create different forms of this. I do think that a lot of that creativity may not come from people that we normally associate with that. But I do think that the issue about investigative reporting and deep level reporting, which is really important on any platform, is a challenge. So I think that's why this is really important stuff. We don't know the answers to a lot of this, but we need some of the traditions that we have in our society, and a commitment to both the First Amendment and a fair and free press. But then I think we have to unleash some of the potential and creativity. Like Kayvon, I think he dropped out of Stanford at 19 to do this. And I remember him asking, I was like, yeah, actually, in your case, I think I would drop out and go do this. And I think he was 20 when he started Periscope. So, but he's got to then take some responsibility. He's got to learn from Noah or Sacha or Jill about what that means.
But the answer is definitely yes, that the declining attention span does affect how we report. There's a huge push to make stories shorter, and reporters lament that because what you're writing feels more superficial. We still do in-depth investigative pieces, but we often wonder, are people reading to the end?
And the last thing I'd say is, when starting Common Sense News, which Nicco's had a real hand in, and a couple of our colleagues are here in the audience tonight, I think that there should be, we've been talking about this, whether we should do a version for kids, right? In the old days of highlights or Time for Kids and stuff. And I don't think that's going to come from Time Magazine. I don't mean that in a bad way. And I think it would be interesting, but I think young people would have to lead the creation of that. So I think we should turn it over to some of you guys, and you should leave the Kennedy School and start creating some of this stuff.
We have a lot of questions. We're running out of time, so we'll do two more and then see. That may be all we have time for. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dan Reinisch. I'm a staff member here at the Kennedy School, but prior to this, taught a high school journalism class for 7 years. So I hear what you're saying in terms of the best way to learn how to appreciate and consume the news is to be writing it and creating it. But I also recognize Rick's concern about that being a luxury. Certainly having a 90-minute class period, even room for that in a student's schedule, or the staffing to run a program like that is certainly a challenge. So I was wondering if you could possibly talk a bit about the source of the skepticism about incorporating news literacy into the curriculum, but also how can we incorporate that into the existing curriculum when we know that school districts are going to potentially balk at, well, I can't add this, but how can we retool what we're already doing so that we're not really adding, we're just improving?
Well, like Rick, I'm not very optimistic about that one. I mean, as Jim said, I'm married to a teacher, and it's really hard for them to add things to the curriculum given what they already have. So I'm not positive about that one.
I think you got to build it into the existing curriculum. I mean, I actually think you make it part of history, and I do think, but no one said this is easy, but most of the important things in life generally aren't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say about this that, the news is fantastically interesting, right, or can be. I mean, it's a wonderful way to develop critical thinking skills. I mean, Jim mentioned this. So the case for it is really strong, but as you know, there are a lot of schools out there that aren't teaching critical thinking skills. I mean, it's not built into their curriculum. So that's in many ways, that's the bigger issue to me. It's not whether you are having a news literacy class, although I think it's wonderful that you did that. It's, are we really teaching critical thinking skills in powerful ways in schools typically? And we're not right now. So that seems like the big challenge.
Hi, my name is Kira Nazish, and I'm a journalist, just visiting Boston, and I came to you here. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. It was such an interesting discussion. I did have a question about media's adaptive approach versus directive approach. I feel like, with as Jill was talking about New York Times subscriptions going down, and you were talking about Boston Globe, we see that media and journalism, like organizations are drying up with financial resources and all that, and then the internet came in, and that changed the landscape of how journalism and media works. So I think that we have been adapting a lot, and media has been adapting a lot to what audiences need and what audiences want to see, which is also, like, I think what Weiss and BuzzFeed has been doing. They have been approaching the audience the way the audience responds quickly. Is there any kind of, I wonder what your comments are, if there's anything, any discussion going on in the newsrooms about how can newsrooms be more directive to their audience and bring in more awareness about why journalism is important, because at the end of the day, it's public service, and if people keep losing the interest in media, they would essentially not be well informed and would not be good at the end of the day for what we want to do as journalists.
The current political situation is giving media outlets the perfect opportunity to do that, and many of them are jumping on board. The New York Times has a prominent, subscribe. The Washington Post has changed it. What is it? Democracy dies in darkness. I mean, I think we're trying to convey that message, but we still rely on people subscribing. Yeah. And
Times right now has a program where you can make a donation for subscriptions for schools and young people. Yeah.
I think people are increasingly getting the importance and the value. It's just trying to persuade them to buy it. And again, that's where I think there's a concern that at least with the people of a certain age and under, why would they buy it? It's free. And I don't know how you break that mindset once it's created. So that's our financial dilemma. That's our revenue dilemma.
What about, I understood the question differently, which is, like, think about the prior question about short attention spans. Yeah. Like, what is the role of news organizations, not necessarily to deliver things for shorter attention spans, but to build longer attention spans? It's like, yeah, like the vegetables, right? How do you force people to eat the vegetables?
I think the answer is, well, it's hard, but the answer is storytelling. It's compelling storytelling. It's at the end of the day, there's a lot. I mean, if you would have told me that a movie about investigative reporting at the Boston Globe, the pedophile pre-scandal would be a huge hit, I would have said no freaking way. Like that sounds, or like searching through archives and differently than that. Yeah, but I'm saying, but because that was well crafted and it was a beautifully told story, people got drawn into it, and to me, that's the answer is always storytelling.
So there's a big debate in our industry now about being a paper of record versus a paper of interest. In the old days, we were the newspaper of record. Whatever happened yesterday, we told you today. Whatever happens today, we'll tell you tomorrow. We really can't afford to do that anymore. And also I think we're writing a lot of things that people aren't interested in. So now we're saying, okay, if we're a paper of interest, what do we write for people that's interesting? I feel very uneasy about that because I feel like if we're picking and choosing what we give you, what's not being covered? I think we are heading in that direction. We are looking for more quirky things. I mean, it kind of falls in the happy news category. We have this one reporter who's really great at spotting interesting things. And about a month ago, a couple was traveling on a really busy road somewhere in Boston, and their cat jumped out the window. And they were just distraught, and they hung flyers everywhere. Like a week or two later, these construction workers were working on the bridge where the cat had jumped out, and the cat had been in the rafters of this bridge for 2 weeks. So he wrote this wonderful story, and it went gangbusters on the web. I think that's an example of a really interesting story that isn't completely frivolous, but kind of people can relate to. But we can't be all that, right? It has to be the mixture of that. So I think we're figuring it out as we go, based on public interest, attention spans, revenue pressure, financial issues. It's a changing time for the media.
It's a fine closing note. Changing time for the media. I really want to thank the panelists, Jim for coming from San Francisco, Sacha for making time from a busy reporter's life, Noah coming up from New York, Jill taking time away from various commitments, and Rick for stepping in to moderate. Thank you so much.